Hey, we're back again one more time on the Level Up podcast. For those of you who are new, the Level Up podcast was designed and developed to facilitate challenging, real, raw conversations with minorities about their unique experiences in the workforce. And I am once again with Kristine Snow, the Level D&I, CEO.
Hi.
And we have a new guest. On this show, we have the pleasure of sitting down with the U.S. Navy vet, Lance Oberlin, to discuss his transitions to the business world and how he's leveraged his experiences in professional journeys. Let's listen a little bit more about how Lance came to understand, apply, and adapt military skills, techniques for use in his civilian career success. Hey, Lance, how's it going?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this. Can you tell us a little bit more about your backstory? What led you down this particular career path from college to the military and now to Legion?
Sure. My story in particular isn't a whole lot different. It's going to sound pretty unique probably, but it's not a whole lot different from anyone else who's gone in the military for the most part. Primarily, you might see a couple different reasons that people end up in the military. One reason might be that they have planned on joining just maybe their whole life. They've worked very hard in school, gotten great grades, and joined through one of the service academies. They might have also just always planned to enlist outside of high school. That does happen to quite a few individuals.
Okay.
Me in particular, the military was more of a second or maybe even a third chance for me. That's not uncommon with many people who wind up in the Navy or any of the other service branches. Me in particular, I graduated high school not really knowing what I wanted to do. And I went to school at Tiffin University for a couple years, transferred to Bowling Green State University, partied a lot. Didn't really care about the grades that much. And ultimately, I got really burnt out and dropped out.
Okay.
So I had about 3.5 years of undergraduate school when I dropped out. That last half a year probably didn't count. So I probably had about 3 years of good credits. And then I went to into an internship that I already had and just did that full time. That was at, believe it or not, Burger King. So I was a management trainee for quite a while at Burger King. It was a job. I went through their management training program, and I remember one time I was at the top of that class. There were probably 10 or 12 of us, and you take tests all the time on different things like food preparation, and they want you to know about health and safety with regard to food, obviously.
So it's like McDonald's University almost.
Yes, at a metropolitan level, right? So I'm from Toledo, Ohio originally, so this was in the Toledo, Ohio area.
Is that where Burger King is based, in Toledo?
No, it's the franchise. That particular franchise was big, and so it was that Toledo area Burger King franchise. Okay. And so that school was taught by like their best manager ever, probably. The problem was, that I came in there with a lot of education. And so I remember one day she was making fun of me for writing complete sentences on one of the tests.
Oh, wow.
I got 100 on. And I just remember thinking that I was done with it. Why am I here? And so probably the next day it was just weird timing that one of the Navy recruiters called me. It was probably a year prior that he had tried recruiting me for the first time when I was still in school. My grades were good. I didn't really need to go in the military or want to at that time. And he was just following up, and I was ready to join. At that point, I'll take something else. And I went in and told him that I wanted to go to Florida, and I wanted to learn about electronics, which was totally different than what I had been studying in college. And they told me they had the job for me, and they did. So I moved down to, I guess before I moved down to Florida, I went through boot camp in Great Lakes, Illinois, just north of Chicago, and got through that. That's always an interesting time for anyone. You'll get through so long as you know how to keep your mouth shut and do what people tell you, you'll be fine. There are some people who cannot do that, and then they'll punish everybody for it. That's just the way it is. But you do learn some things when you go through a system like that. You learn, for one thing, that your actions might have repercussions for other people. But I will say that once I got through boot camp, I moved down to Pensacola, Florida for a year, went through a bunch of electronic schools. I was starting to really enjoy the new life that I had embarked on, which was great.
When you say electronics, like what, can you get into specifics of what they had you doing?
Yeah, sure. So down in Pensacola, at least at the time, there were a couple different bases at least. One is your big aviation base that a lot of people in aviation jobs probably go and get trained at. The base I was on was a cryptologic base, and the job that I was in was electronics, but it was electronics that were specifically used for cryptologic activities. So in my case, I was what's called an electronic warfare technician, which on a ship will manage and operate the systems used for countermeasures against missiles, so like anti-ship missile defense, and then also just enemy radars as well. So
that sounds really exciting.
Yeah, it was like
cool. The entire suite of like warfare, artillery. I don't know what you call it. Yeah. So there was a lot of systems involved that were very specific to this line of work. But the electronics piece of it is you got to be able to maintain and conduct maintenance and know how these systems work. And that takes a lot of training, and then it takes a lot of on-the-job training too once you get to a ship after school, right? Because you obviously don't learn everything in school like any job.
So you obviously ended up making the transition into the corporate sector, which is when you and I met. But I don't know if we ever discussed this before. Why did you decide to make the transition from military to corporate?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I had actually decided to get out of the Navy when my enlistment was up, but I had fortunately been selected for a program called the Seaman to Admiral program, which is where they take enlisted sailors and send them back to undergrad. You finish your degree and then they commission you as an officer. So I did that program and then had a couple jobs as an officer. And I had gotten to the point where I knew that I didn't want to be the captain of a ship anymore. And it is such a demanding job that, in my personal opinion, once you figure out you don't want that top position, then it's time to get out. It's time to not put in that amount of time and energy away from family and friends towards a goal that, if you don't want it anymore, then it's probably time to reposition your efforts towards a different goal that maybe you're more interested in, which was my case.
Well, that's interesting, and we're gonna come back there a little bit later. So on the point of that self-awareness that you deployed to make that transition. I think as a ex-collegiate football player, understanding, knowing when to fold it is very important. I think a lot of us kind of get hung up, not just military guys, but student athletes and folks who are making transitions in general kind of get stuck in the positions that they're in because they don't have the self-awareness to know when to make the move. What were you most proud of during your time in the military?
Oh, that's a good question. I would have to say that I felt like a very effective leader when I was in the military, and I did take a lot of pride in that. When I look back on my time in the military, the people that I was able to lead and work with, that is definitely the best. Like, those are the best of my memories, right, of the military, are the things that we were able to do, that the things we worked through and were able to accomplish. Anytime you're in an environment like that, it's kind of a controlled chaos, just because even just on a ship, right? It's a basically an industrial area. Things are breaking all the time. You've got to send resources to different places to meet different needs around the ship. And it's a very challenging environment, especially if you're, geographically, in a hot area, both, literally and figuratively. If you're talking about an area that's a danger, and then also an area that could be, potentially very, very hot and put stress on the systems on the ship as well. I would say that definitely it would be the people, having had the opportunity to work with the people that I was able to work with in the Navy was definitely, those are my favorite memories.
And you spoke a little bit about meeting Kristine a little bit earlier in your career, a little bit when we were offline. Could you kind of double click into that? And Kristine, please, I'm interested to hear this story.
Yeah, so I was working for Fast Switch, which is now Rebel IT, as a recruiter at the time. I think it was back in 2012, I want to say, maybe 13.
Probably.
Yeah.
I got out in 2013, so it probably was 2012.
Okay. Yeah, so I was working with a group at Cardinal Health called VPAC, which was a veteran transitioning program. And at the time, I was just going into their different cohorts that they had coming through and talking to them about what it's like to work in the corporate sector, how to kind of take your military resume and transition it into layman's terms or corporate lingo so people understand what you did. And I met Lance through that program because he was trying to get in with a corporate company, and Cardinal Health has a really good reputation for bringing on a lot of veterans. So him and I worked together, and we ended up getting him in as a project lead over in Cardinal's shared services area of business, and he moved up really quickly through the ranks over there, and then we've kind of stayed in touch over the years as his career has evolved, and so has mine. And yeah, we're still in touch today now that he's at Allegiant, and just continuing that relationship and trying to help others along the way make that transition. So things have been good.
Yeah, so Kristine was a huge help to me. I had reached out to many recruiters, had many conversations while I was planning to leave the Navy and join the private sector, and the amount of help that I got from Kristine was pretty awesome. I had received a lot of help from a lot of different people, which was very beneficial to me, especially when you're talking about resume writing, because the amount of military acronyms that exist that just confuse people is huge. And so I would say that every time I talk to anyone that was willing to help me, who might be in an area that might be beneficial to help me, it definitely, I'm very grateful for that, because it definitely helped me get one step closer to getting a role that I would have liked in the private sector. When I met Kristine, she did a whole lot more for me, though, especially when it came to just understanding the just the benefits that I could bring to a private sector organization. And
let's talk about that, because
yeah.
I mean, I think that's a really good segue into a question I was going to ask a little bit further down the line. We spoke a little bit about some of the resources that you were able to leverage from Kristine in terms of the resume prep. I think we call it how to play up sports or how to play up the military on your resume. Yeah. And that's like very vague, but what are some of the resources that you are still leveraging today?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So in terms of veterans resources that I leverage today, I would have to point to information that I'm able to gather online, especially through the VA with regard to the post 9/11 GI Bill. Even though I am, well into a career now in the private sector, I still have benefits that are available to me, and that I take advantage of. I paid for my MBA with the post 9/11 GI Bill. There's a lot of benefits available to a lot of veterans out there that should be used.
Yeah, here locally in Columbus too, there's a nonprofit called Reboot, run by Aaron Zuber. I don't know if you know him, but they're a really good resource out there. And they focus a lot on companies too, on how to get them hiring in veterans. So that's really helpful. And then I think a lot of different companies have programs. Like I mentioned VPAC with Cardinal Health, which is really helpful. Rebel IT has MTAC, which is Military Transition Assistance Course, and that's for veterans and their families. So there's a lot of resources out there to help make that transition, because I think what people don't typically understand, that I learned pretty early on, was that there's not a whole lot in the transition that can't be done pretty streamlined, because people coming in the military, even if they're going into like entry level roles, they're not entry level people. Like that was the thing with Lance. It was really an education on the client side, is that, okay, even though you're looking at his resume and it doesn't say he graduated with a degree in project management and then was a project analyst and a project lead and now he's ready for this role, he managed these multi-million-dollar projects and infrastructure, which is the same thing you're doing. How do we reword that and convey that to the client in a way that they're going to understand? And I think that's the biggest hurdle to getting in. And then I can't speak to what Lance goes through once he gets in the door and has to learn an entire new dictionary and throw out his old one, but I'm sure you can just equate it to learning any new language. It's kind of how it is.
I think you hit it definitely I think you hit it on the head with that. I think even prior to just trying to figure out what that language needs to be, so you can know how to communicate with these tools, like your LinkedIn profile. Now, I don't necessarily know if LinkedIn was around back in those days, but leveraging those resources and being able to speak to these different audience that are employers. What are 5 things you wish someone told you before you actually started?
LinkedIn was around in 2013, by the way.
Yeah.
I wasn't on it yet. I guess I was a little...
Carter's a baby, but yes, LinkedIn was around.
Yeah, LinkedIn was around. I'm sure it was I don't remember what it was like. I know that it was possible to reach out to people, because I reached out to a ton of people, which was beneficial to me, just to see if somebody, would you be willing to look at my resume, give me some feedback. In terms of veterans who were already in the private sector, I would reach out to them on LinkedIn, people who were doing things that I might be interested in, to get their feedback and just understand, what their advice would be for someone like me. This is advice that I just did not, or knew I would not get in the Navy's transition assistance program, which when I was in, was just notoriously had a very, very bad reputation, in 2013, in 2012, 2013. I hope that it's improved since then, but at the time it was not that great. It was something that you would have to go through, and it just wasn't very good at preparing you. So what I had tried to do was just take some initiative on my own and get some advice from people who had already made the transition, and from people who might have, who might want to help me, like you're a great example, and just have some really good information that you could share with me that might make me, a more competitive job seeker.
Yeah, hopefully we have a lot more resources for our troops today in terms of actually accessing those mentors and career coaches and people like Kristine who can actually help you figure out what you need to do to put yourself in position to be successful. Kristine, could you speak a little bit more about like some of the things that you guys do for our military and our vets?
Yeah, so we don't do a whole lot of like structured programming here at Revel, but at Level, we're trying to put some of that into place. So going forward, we're partnering with different organizations like Reboot that I mentioned to try to get some things going there. But then we're also in October, we're going to be hosting, well, I say October, but who knows, our time frames may change because of COVID, but we'll see. Right now in October, the plan is to host an all-day military transition course and kind of get that MTAC up and running so that we can help not only military people spinning off of the military, but also their significant others, because a lot of times the significant others of people in the military are also moving from base to base, and they don't have a lot of permanence and time to really set themselves up with a corporate role, which is difficult. And in addition, we're going to be trying to educate employers who are there on what they can do to, one, understand the background of somebody in the military, educate themselves on what the different terminology means, but also how to support those people as they're coming in, because they may need more work from home if it's the spouse of somebody in the military, or they may need more time to come up to speed on how different processes run. They may be a little more rigid than what the corporate world is when they come in and just need time to adjust. So we're trying to educate people on that. And then we're also just working with our clients internally to say, hey, what amount of veterans do you have internally currently? Are they happy here? Do they feel like they have the support they need? Is there any sort of mentorship programs to get them connected with other veterans who have made this transition into your company and things like that? So whether that's an ERG or whatever the case may be, we like to make sure that there's some sort of support system internally as well as all the external offerings.
That's amazing. I mean, that's actually a third time self-awareness came up in the conversation, and actually performing the self-efficacy on yourself to, become a little bit more self-aware about the strengths that you bring to an organization and how that aligns with the organization views. And that kind of brings me to this quote that I heard before. It's like, what comes first? Does the early bird get the worm, or does the bird who matches the sleeping pattern of the early bird gets the worm? And it's like, whichever the bird who knows himself the best and leans on his strengths gets the worm. From that perspective, could you tell me about some of the things that you wish you'd done differently now that you're in the space in your career? I think you've been working in the civilian society a little bit shy of a decade. What are some of the things that you've learned and some of the headwinds that you would have probably avoided?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think probably the biggest learning curve that I had coming out of the Navy was learning how a corporation worked. It probably took me a good 6 months to a year, just like Kristine was mentioning, with just a different type of language. It's not just language, it's also how do companies work, right? Like, you can go through classes, like different education. I'd done a year of MBA by that point. And you can, I had an idea of, like how a business works. Mm-hmm. But it's a lot different once you're sitting in it and you need to start communicating with people. You need to be able to understand things they're talking about. There was a lot of terminology that people use in the private sector that is just totally different than in the military, but it could mean the exact same thing.
Yeah.
Even in terms of the role that I, took, which I think was a project lead role at Cardinal Health, originally, and a project manager deals a lot with project plans, and in the Navy, I never used a project plan. I used a plan of action and milestones, a POAM, which is a common term, almost the exact same thing. I had no idea that a lot of what I was doing was project management while I was in there.
I think I told you that when you were explaining to me your job. I was like, you're a project manager.
Yeah, you're probably like, what's a POAM on your resume? Like, what does this mean?
And you're in tech also, so that's a bit of a different can of worms,
Yeah.
Speaking to the business and speaking to IT is two very different languages.
It's definitely different. One of the benefits of being in IT is that when you're talking about technologies, a lot of the commercial off-the-shelf technologies are the same. So at least on resume, that would be the same. But there's still a lot of technology related to IT in the military that is just used in the defense sector. And so if you're not familiar with the defense sector, it's probably going to be very foreign to you. But those skills are probably very useful to have, right? Especially to be able to communicate appropriately, that you know how to troubleshoot systems, that you know a lot about systems management, systems design, and different things. Those are obviously really marketable skills that quite a few people in the Navy, especially if you are in a technical job, would come out with. And I'm sure, I know I had challenges with being able to articulate that properly. Additionally, I would say that just the ability to have good mentorship on that transition was a challenge for me. And I do think there are a lot more resources in place now, to your original question there. And that, especially, Kristine talked about a lot of great services. There are if you were to just Google it, there are a lot more organizations now of people who were veterans or are veteran friendly, who either within the company, the large corporation, have efforts to help veterans, or nonprofits geared toward helping veterans. Hire Heroes has its own transition training that they give people now. This is all stuff that is beneficial to people coming out of the military, so that they can get a leg up on their military transition. I think that in retrospect, I spent a lot of time getting help from other people, which was fantastic. But I think that I probably could have dug deeper with some of those people and probably learned a lot more prior to the transition, as opposed to just skimming the surface when it comes to, getting help on a resume, or, that's very helpful and it's much needed, but it's still pretty superficial when you talk about, what it's like to actually work in a corporate environment.
Yeah, I think getting the job.
Are you referring to? Oh, go ahead, Kristine.
Oh, sorry. I was gonna say, I think getting the job is like a very small part of the challenge.
Yeah. It doesn't feel that way, obviously, especially when you're leaving the military. It feels like that's the big thing, right? And that's I think that's where a lot of the fear comes from too. As you mentioned earlier, Kristine, you're talking about a lot of mature individuals who, even if they're younger, they may already have a family. It's not, in most cases, it's not the same as just graduating from undergrad and looking for a job, or graduating from high school and looking for a job. It's a matter of, you have a lot of work experience. In many cases, you probably have children or a family, and you're probably worried about your ability to provide for them, because there's some uncertainty with how this job hunt is going to go. I know in my case, I had a salary amount in my head that I thought would allow me to at least make the same amount of money that I was in the military. And I was very fortunate that I was able to use, those skills that I had coming from the Navy as an IT manager, and apply them towards a rewarding career, when I transitioned. I think it's really important for people who are transitioning to think about what they really want to do, what their skill set would allow them to do. And, it's not a bad question to ask of, what roles that you are qualified for, would also reward you the most. And in some cases, financial rewards are important because you might have, mouths to feed.
Yeah, and I can understand how actually jumping into a career that is not necessarily the most rewarding could be appetizing at that point in time in your life, where you may have one or two little ones running around and a family to tend to. You don't necessarily, think about yourself or your career in that manner. As you were, I guess, really trying to figure out with this civilian space, working in this space, understanding the language, have you dealt with any imposter syndrome where you felt like you didn't necessarily have enough or to be able to execute at the level that your resume may have spoken to?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's obviously anytime you're in a position where you're going to have a learning curve. I know that for me, it's definitely possible that I would get some imposter syndrome. And I'm sure that for most people, that's the case as well. Coming out of the military, joining the private sector is, especially if you've been in the service for a long time. I was in the Navy on active duty for 13 years before I transitioned to the private sector. So it was a big chunk of time. So I knew how to do the military really well, but I didn't necessarily know how to do, corporate America that well. And, just figuring things out was challenging. And anytime you are slowed down by trying to, just learn the ropes, especially if you're not in an entry-level role where you're expected to be learning the ropes, it can be challenging. And people's perceptions there are probably a ton of people that were looking at me, not even knowing that I came from the Navy and that this stuff was foreign to me, and just saying wow, he doesn't have it together. When's this guy going to get it together? And it took some time.
Yeah, we have a conversation coming up about those implicit biases that we have in the workforce. And I think a lot of folks generally go to race or gender or ethnicity, but I think that's definitely an implicit bias that a lot of us have as humans. I think even if they knew that you came from the Navy, that may have been another, or something else that you have to battle against, because you guys are supposed to be leaders. You're supposed to have all of this, experience with emotional awareness and all this other type of stuff, because that's how you guys were trained, right?
There can also be some bad stereotypes there too, right? People generally stereotype. Yes,
I didn't want to say it. I was going to let you.
Yeah. So a lot of times people will stereotype, those of us coming out of the service and sometimes it's true. In a lot of cases, I'm sure it is true, where people will just be, like Kristine was saying, very rigid, just maybe very short with their conversations, and maybe not very nice. And as most people know, in corporate America and the private sector, right, relationships matter, and in many ways they matter a lot more than they do in the military, where you have a very explicit chain of command that you're following. It does help to have those relationships in the military, but it's not the same thing. In a lot of ways, there are tons of ways where I'm dealing with people all the time at a Legion or any other company I've worked for where, these people don't work for me. Maybe they're working on a project or some kind of initiative with me, and we have a shared goal, but I need to be able to influence them and help us reach that goal without, them working directly for me. And in the military, you still have a rank, right? And so you can pull rank if you need to, even if someone doesn't directly work for you, you can still pull rank if you need to. That's a benefit of in the military of being able to get things done very quickly. I'm sure there are also some detriments to it as well in the private sector. It just means that being able to influence people, especially being able to influence without authority, knowing how to do that is very important, and understanding relationship building is very important too. If I'd have gotten some training on those types of soft skills, I think prior to transitioning, I'm sure it would have benefited me greatly as I, fumbled through my first year of, being in the private sector.
Well, you're trained to be one way for you like 13 years. You're trained to do things in like a rigid technical manner where the relationship building's not as important, and what's important is getting the job done efficiently and meeting your timelines. And then you go into this corporate sector where things are different. Timelines are still important, financials are still important, but the culture is very important and it's very different. So I think that would be hard to completely like take all your training that you've known and toss it to the side and then retrain your brain to do things in a different way.
And some of those things are very beneficial too. So for example, I coming out of the Navy, I was very used to following up on everything I was doing all of the time. It was one of the things that I probably got complimented on at Cardinal Health the most, that people noticed, that I made an impact on very quickly is, as you were speaking, right, getting things done efficiently. I would make sure that I was relentless in following up with people, and it helped get the job done. Did it help build? It may not have helped me build relationships with those people for like future projects we were working on and things like that. But they definitely knew that, what work was a priority, and they knew that I was going to ask them about it every day. And so they knew they needed to get it done, if they wanted, me to stop harassing them probably.
Yeah, but how do you walk that line, between building those relationships and still being able to deliver that efficiency?
Yeah, it's something to learn for sure.
So aside of your relentless nature for getting things done and following up, like how else have being in the military set you up for success in your civilian role?
Yeah, so I would think one of the biggest things that most people who are in the military at any stage of a military career that they'll benefit from when they transition is the amount of leadership opportunities that are there. So in the Navy, even if enlisted ranks start at E1, which is a seaman recruit, and there are just many different ranks above that. And really at any of those ranks, there are many opportunities to lead other sailors and get experience with managing teams. So much so that if you are in the military for a few years, you probably have a tremendous amount of time that you have spent managing teams. I think it's something that people in the military, especially the Navy, do very well, is management of teams and understanding that that there's a shared team goal, and that the sum of all the members of the team, when they form up to do something and accomplish something, it's larger than the sum of the. It's larger than just all of the individual parts. And I think that that one thing is probably the biggest opportunity that people are given, and it's probably the most beneficial trait coming out of the military that they have to offer is just a ton of leadership experience. When people transition out of the Navy or out of the military in general, compared to their peers, it would not surprise me at all. And this is not a knock on anyone who did not serve in the military. I'm just saying that compared to their peers, when people get out of the military, they probably have a lot more leadership experience.
I've noticed a lot with people we've worked with back in the day when we were doing all the stuff with VPAC. I worked with a ton of veterans, all in the project management space in IT. And one thing I noticed between them and the candidates from the private sector that we were working with is just the ability to like stay cool under pressure, handle these huge projects, and not feel overloaded. So I think that's something that a lot of employers should think about if they're bringing on people from the military, is they can handle a lot of pressure, fast-paced timelines, things that would feel a little bit insurmountable to people coming out of the corporate sector who maybe haven't dealt with that high-pressure situation. I think people from the military are like, this isn't life and death, literally. So
so I have absolutely felt the way that you are, talking about right now. And so I would say that you're right. There are a lot of situations where if something is done wrong, someone could get seriously injured or die. Not only that, but a lot of times that you're doing that type of work, you've got other things going on too that you're keeping track of, that you've got people off doing. What I'm just trying to convey is that there's usually a lot of moving parts that leaders are managing in the military, and it's not and you have to be comfortable with risk, like real risk. And what I will tell you is that you might still be nervous. There was a time I was on the bridge of a ship, and we had a lot of I think we had small boat operations going on, and we might have had helicopter operations going on at the same. We had multiple things going on that on their own are serious on their own, let alone to, combining them all at the same time. And I remember the captain asked me if I was nervous, and my reply was yes. Yeah, I'm very nervous. Which is the right answer. You should be nervous, but you need to know how to manage those emotions so that you can still get the job done. And it's hard sometimes. I definitely had the thought go through my head while I was in the private sector, where I would just want to say, like, this isn't that serious,
like no one's gonna die today.
But people, but it's also the wrong thing to say, right? Because when you're talking to a leader, they want to know that you're taking it seriously, and that the investment that you're managing is not going to fail or go to waste. And saying that it's not that big of a deal is the wrong answer to them, right? And so learning how to articulate that, even though you might feel differently, even though nobody might die, learning how to articulate that to reassure them, and let them know that, that the efforts are in good hands, it can be a little bit of work if you are not used to needing to, articulate those things.
Absolutely. I think that there's definitely a lot of table dressing, that we have to do in terms of articulating how we feel about the work product that we're producing. Being an ex-athlete, just playing linebacker in general, you got 6'6", 365-pound young men. Most of the case have like daddy issues and just angry at the world. And that's in between. That's the guy who's in between you and your scholarship. Like that's a situation. I don't necessarily know if the jammed paper machine is as big as a deal, Dan.
Yeah, and that may not be, but I will tell you that I do think there's some legitimacy though to it, in that you might be running a project that you might have a budget from anywhere from $20,000 to millions of dollars, and you should be taking it seriously. This is not play money. These are real investments. And I do think that people from the military that transition do take things seriously. They would take that seriously, but there is there's certainly a change. They're all important risks. It's just there are different types of risks, and it's a different audience too. So if you need to be mindful of the audience, obviously, the way that you're communicating, and so you may not feel that the risk is the same, as when lives are on the line. But you shouldn't forget that, it's very important how you responsibly manage the things that you're in charge of in the private sector.
I can agree with that. I definitely think there's a deep-seated level of empathy that needs to be deployed in those situations. Your life might not be on the line, but your livelihood may.
Yeah.
And you have a lot of folks, including yourself, that you may have to feed or pay for college or things of that nature. And those are pressures and psychological things that people go through every day that we work with. And we have to be aware of that. Especially, I think the situation that we're in now, COVID-19, is a really good example of how we need to work with each other moving forward and being a little bit more empathy to everybody's situation. I don't have children. Everyone on my team does.
Yeah.
So I should, we have to be a little bit more flexible when we get the projects done. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think you made a great point there. It's really important to be more empathetic. It's also really important to understand the changing economic environment. It may be a time where you didn't need to as frugally manage the funds that you were in charge of, but now maybe you need to, because we just live in a time where there's a lot of uncertainty in the current economic environment. As these things change, the way that we need to manage people and resources could potentially change. I'm sure they will. And so it's really important to understand. It's really important to understand how different variables affect the way that we need to manage people. And obviously our experiences, prior to this point, play a big role in our ability to, just in our management toolbox and the tools we have to manage those people as well.
I think veterans could be a really valuable asset to companies during a crisis like COVID, because you guys are used to reacting to unexpected situations and adapting to those and figuring out how to move forward. So companies should be leaning on those types of resources. I think all people with a diverse background would be helpful, because diversity comes up with innovative solutions. They're creative thinkers, think outside the box than what the norm is within your company. But I think having that structured, quick on your feet mindset would definitely be helpful.
Definitely. Yeah. I think we have to do a really good job at bringing that notion to the eye level also. From the academic standpoint, Lance, you struggled a little bit early in your career trying to figure out just the language of it all. I think sometimes if you weren't in those situations, you would have no idea. I think, folks who weren't in military or weren't athletes at one point in their career, they really don't know. They only have an outside view of the real, skill sets that we have to leverage to get those jobs done.
Yeah.
I think we learned a lot from you today, Dan. And as we wrap, transitioning from the military can be challenging between addressing the technical and the soft skills with employers to establishing a strong value and presence in interviews. I think we spoke a little bit about that, Kristine. But military skills are especially helpful for business professionals to understand, plan, execute, and provide business plans and operations. What can companies do to better support our veterans moving forward?
Yeah, so me personally, I think that as long as companies have, create a level playing field for veterans to compete for roles that they are competitive for, I think that's a great thing. I think that's all that if you asked anyone that they would ask for. I am not asking for any kind of handouts or any kind of playing field where I'm looked at more favorably because I'm a veteran, I would just ask that, maybe you take into account some of the things that I've done throughout my career, when job hunting. Obviously, I'm not doing that now, but if I'm a transitioning sailor, that's going to be huge because I'm coming out with a lot of different experiences, and a lot of them are usually communicated in a way that isn't normal to the private sector, and is probably very confusing with lots of acronyms. We love our acronyms in the Navy and in the military.
So companies just educated themselves on what all that meant. Then I think there wouldn't really be an issue there because the experience is still the experience. I mean, you have it relates to what you'd be doing. It's just not exactly the same.
And being able to leverage, sometimes just having an open enough mind to leverage veterans you currently have working at the company is a good thing too. I've had resumes put in front of me and asking for advice on, what do I see on there? This person's, applying for this job, but maybe it's not that clear what their resume actually entails. And I would be able to tell you, they're probably embellishing some things, or no, they probably do have the right, experience that you're looking for, that type of thing. So I think in a lot of cases, companies have the resources available to them already. It's just a matter of utilizing them in a way that, they can benefit from it.
Yeah, I think for companies, it's really important, especially if you're a really large company, to have internal employee resource groups for veterans or for people who were spouses of veterans, so that they have a group of people to come to and talk to and have mentorship opportunities and sponsorship opportunities, but also for those situations like Lance just mentioned. So if I'm a manager of a team and I get a veteran resume and I'm like, well, I don't know what any of this means, I have a set place I can go to say, hey, can you take a look at this resume, instead of just tossing it to the side because I don't understand it.
Yeah, it's okay not to know, but it's not okay to not seek the information from someone who may. Yeah. And I think Level does a really good job of being able to provide that information. Lance spoke a lot about leveling the playing field, and I think we can probably leverage that as a soundbite. We need to get that Lance to write off on that, but I think that's exactly what Level D&I is trying to do, and also this Level Up podcast, being able to provide a voice for folks to give access to this type of information that a director or an employer may not necessarily want to ask because it may be taboo in the space or things of that nature. So as we close, I want to just, thank everyone again for tuning in with us at Level Up Podcast. Please like, comment, subscribe, share on all your platforms. And this has been a great one. Thanks, Lance and Kristine, once again. Until next time.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for having me.